Tip O'Neill became a very good friend, and I became the Michigan whip, which meant my job was to try to figure out and get the Michigan, particularly the Michigan Democrats, to vote for different bills that would come up on the calendar. And we would know on Thursday morning at a meeting what would be coming up the following week, and then try to take soundings and call our colleagues up and see how they stood and what information they needed, what the speaker's position was, what the committee chairman's position was. And so I for about 4 years, spent every Thursday morning as part of a small group sitting with Tip O'Neill in his office, going through our agenda and his thinking, you know, whether he was ruminating about Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan, and just listening to Tip tell stories. I remember those more than the particular legislation. And I remember him talking about Reagan. You know, today, I should say in 2011, people talk about how Tip and Reagan got along really well, and they did this, they did that. But I remember Tip talking about Reagan, and Tip really liked Reagan personally, but he didn't really take Reagan seriously on substantive issues. He really relied more on dealing with the cabinet and the White House staff. I don't think he felt that Ronald Reagan knew that much about what they were doing. But Tip loved Ronald Reagan, but I don't think he viewed him as a substantive player, which is interesting. Now, Tip himself was not all that buried in issues either. So, but he was very substantive compared to Ronald Reagan. When I arrived in Congress, the speaker was Carl Albert, and he was a real gentleman, but in his later stages, and he was a really good guy, and he'd been a Rhodes Scholar, he'd been everything, he was from Oklahoma, but he gave the appearance of being over the hill and weak, whereas Tip was big guy, full of life, Irish Catholic from Boston, could tell jokes and stories, and I had played a key role in Watergate, along with Peter Rodino. And so I kept thinking, you know, Tip should be speaker, not Carl Albert. You know, it should be Tip. And he was majority leader. So I asked for a meeting with him, and they invited me to his office to have a sandwich with him, which was a big deal. Because remember, there's 435 members of Congress, and at that time there were probably 250 or 60 Democrats. And so that was really exciting. I went to his office, and he was eating like an egg salad sandwich and having a Coca-Cola. And I said, Tip, you know, I know this is confidential, but, you know, you really need to become speaker here. Albert does not project well for us. You know, he's older and this and that, and, you know, you need to maneuver him out or find a way to get him to step down or something. And he looked at me and said, what am I supposed to do? You know, hey, Jimmy boy, he said, look, I'm a loyal guy here. He's not going to serve forever. I'm his majority leader. He's the speaker. I'm loyal. What do you think I could do about this? That would be I can't do that. I appreciate your support, but be patient. You can't change things overnight. I said, I know, but you would be so much better. Well, I always remember that. And of course, what happened was at the end of the Congress, Albert announced his retirement, and then Tip became speaker. That was a year after that luncheon, but I was a little impatient. But most of the younger members felt the way I did, that Tip would be a better. We never imagined that years later Republicans would hire an actor to imitate O'Neill and make it sound like he was a bad guy. He was a great guy. Everybody there knew it, including all the Republicans. He also came in for a fundraiser for me, I remember. And we had a wonderful fundraiser in Michigan. Tip was my special guest, and it was overflow, just as the one we had for Peter Rodino. And I must tell you, every Irish Catholic in the entire state wanted to come, claimed they were his friend, wanted a private meeting. One guy even threatened to try to hijack him when he came through the jetway out of the plane. I mean, you wouldn't believe the stories we heard, and I would mention some of these names to Tip and never heard of them. So now Tip wasn't always great on meetings, on names. Good in Congress, he knew everybody's name, usually. But once Tip, this is a true story, Tip O'Neill was in the airport in Denver. He arrived there for a big speech and a fundraiser for the Democrats. And he's walking through the airport with his aides, and one of them is one of my friends, Mike Farrell. And Robert Redford is coming the other way. And he stops and he says, "Mr. Speaker, how are you? Bob Redford, how are you? And how's it going? I really admire you, and you got to sock it to those Republicans." And Tip is talking to him, and they're walking along. And then Tip finally says, "Bob, who are you with?" I didn't know who Redford was. We laughed. We thought, obviously, Tip is not going to the movies these days. In fact, and Robert Redford, by the way, was Irish Catholic as well. So we still laugh about that. And you know, it's one of the Tip stories. There are a million of them. He is missed, and boy, I'll tell you, Congress could use Tip O'Neill today. They could use Ted Kennedy. A lot of people like that. We really need them.